Welcome to the MAM Journals. Some of you might recall that actually I had one of the first Jaffas that arrived in the UK, and I bought it in 2018. Some people actually occasionally ask me and they say, have you ever bought a bike that you haven't actually test rode? Well, if you ever meet me, ask me the story, because I can actually do better than that. But if I bought a Jaffa, why have I now got this, as we know it, the yellow ball? Well, I think I should need to go back in time. The bike that actually inspired a lifelong of motorcycle enthusiasm and passion was a bike that I saw in 1973 in the Market Square in Stamford in Lincolnshire. It was a 1973 yellow ball. I was in my early teens and I saw it and said to myself, I am going to be a motorcyclist. So that bike has got a lot to answer for. When I saw that this one came out, which is the closest you can probably get to that original yellow and green version, I thought when it came out, I shall get one of those. And they came out and they were called SEs, and it was a special edition. I missed the first batch and I thought, well, never mind, wasn't to be. But when they announced they were doing them again, they were more special equipment as opposed to special editions when they relaunched them. And I thought, I'm not going to make the same mistake twice. I'm buying one of those. And I did. So this is the story of how I'm getting on with my Z900RS SE and the first 200 and something odd miles that I've covered on the bike. How I'm going to do it is we're going to talk about the specifications of the bike. I'm going to talk about what a standard one has, and what this has got, and a couple of other things that I want to go through. I'm then going to show you some footage from a GoPro of riding it and talk about running in and various other things. And then I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about my conclusions on how I got on. As always, I hope that you enjoy the video. Okay, so let's go through the specifications of the bike. To make it easier for you, I'm going to try and separate it into three areas. I'm going to talk about a standard Z900RS. I'm then going to talk about the implications and ramifications of Euro 4 and 5 and what that is actually doing to bikes in general and to this one in particular. I'm then going to talk about what the SE has got so that you'll have a clear picture of the differences in spec and how the bike is evolving. All Z900RSs are fitted with a 948cc. They're a 4-cylinder, liquid-cooled, dual overhead cam engine. They produce 109 brake horsepower. I do occasionally see journalists or web details saying 111, but that's PS, not brake horsepower. It also produces 98.5 Newton meters at 6,500. The bike is fitted standard with a 4-into-1 exhaust, which is slightly ironic in that that's the type of exhaust we all fitted back in the 70s when we bought a Z1 and threw the 4-into-4 into the bin, and nowadays we throw the 4-into-1 into the bin and see if we can buy a different exhaust. But that's part of the ironies of life. The bike is fitted with a 6-speed gearbox, and in terms of dimensions and sort of wheelbase, which is often a good way to get an idea about what the bike is designed to do and will deliver, I think in inches, this is 57.87 contact point to contact point. So that's what I call middle of the road wheelbase. It's neither sporty, something like 55 would be a sports bike, or 60 would be something like a comfortable tourer, BMW GS, something like that. So it's designed to be, as I say, capable of reasonably sporty behaviour and reasonably stable at speeds as well. If you think in millimetres, and some of you I know do, that's 1470 millimetres long. They're now talking about something called road clearance in bike specifications. Quite what that's measuring, I'm not entirely sure. I will get to the bottom of it. But for the standard bike, you get 130 millimetres of clearance, and although we're getting slightly in front of ourselves with an SE, you get 140. And interestingly enough, that's the difference between the seat height on the standard RS and the SE, because the standard bike is 835 millimetres, whilst the SE is described as 845. That's getting towards the upper end of some like me, the vertically challenged, of what you find comfortable, but you can get various seat options to change it around. And of course you can adjust the suspension, but seat might be better. But we'll come to suspension a bit later on. In terms of weight of the bike, when it was launched in November 2017 from memory, but it arrived in the UK 2018, it was launched with 215 kilograms. That's still the weight that they're stating. That in old money, if you think in old money, is £474. I said in my introduction that I'd talk briefly about Euro 4 and Euro 5. As the name implies, these are emission control regulations which only actually apply to Europe. Globally, there is acceptance that emissions need to be controlled, but how they're controlled and quite what the regulations mean varies from continent to continent. As an example, in the UK, you could no longer buy a GSX-R 750, the Suzuki Gixxer, from I think probably about 5 years ago, but you can still buy them brand new in America and in Australia. So there are some strange anomalies in how we're all going around sorting emissions, but we just deal with the ones we've got. So what is it actually doing, and what are they trying to do? Well, really, as I say, it's about emissions, and one of the characteristics of bikes that are being controlled by this legislation is the introduction of catalytic converters, which of course require fast heat into them to be effective. So on the Z900RS, you get a very obvious start-up, high revs sequence to drive heat into the catalytic converter. So it is in relation to the regulations. The other consequence that you get is as the bikes run sort of lean, which I'll touch on later when we talk about riding, snatchy throttles are a direct consequence of European regulation in terms of controls. Engineers are perfectly capable of making these bikes run smoothly, but not and complying with the regulations that prevail. It also results in some pretty big exhausts as they put various other control mechanisms into the exhaust and not just at the front end. So, for example, the Hayabusa has a cat in the exhaust as well, and they end up looking like they could launch torpedoes, which they probably could. It also generates heat. So what you are seeing now in certainly Europe, the difference between Euro 4 and Euro 5 in terms of the Z900RS is you're seeing bigger radiators as they try, because heat and power are not the best of friends. So you do need to try and keep them cool in order to get any level of performance out of them. So that's that sort of battle going on. I suspect we're approaching the end game in Europe, at least, with straight 4s on motorbikes. I don't think there's many who think they can get one through Euro 6 and end up with a bike that actually justifies being a straight 4. And we're already seeing it in the marketplace. We're seeing parallel twins emerging as new technology, and of course we all know there's been parallel twins for years, and we went to 4s because they're slightly more exciting and have that great sort of on the cam performance. But it is what it is. I think we'd probably have an interesting debate between us all about how to get there, but I'd like to think that most of us would agree it is a good thing that we're trying to control and protect the environment. There are consequences, and you can feel it in the bike. Right, the specifications of the SE itself can be divided into 3 simple categories, and we should talk about brakes, suspension and aesthetics. So if I talk about brakes first, because it's probably the most straightforward, it's basically they're radial brakes, very like the standard bike is, but they're Brembos, and they've got Brembo discs and different Brembo calipers and different discs on them. I'll perhaps make a comment on that later on the video about whether I think that they actually make any difference, but to give you a clue, yes they do. Suspension is probably the next most significant change, and indeed, if I'm honest, it was the first thing I changed on my Jaffa, because I didn't think the standard suspension, and in particular the rear shock, was up to much. You do get a lot more adjustment on the rear, which is an Ohlins unit, and it's got what's called remote adjustment. That's this device here, which is hydraulic adjusting that, and you've also got in there a far easier way of adjusting your rebound on the unit than the screw mechanism. You've also got much more adjustment in it, which is what you were really looking for. I felt that the rear shock ran out of ideas quite quickly on the standard bike. Some people like them, and that's entirely their prerogative, but for me there was not enough range of adjustment for me to get it where I wanted to do. In terms of that unit fitted to the SE, I give you an idea of the range. I won't bother with sort of trying to explain how to do it. I could do that later on if we ever need to. But the softest setting on that is 6 up from baseline anti-clockwise. The standard setting is 13, and the hardest setting is 26 clicks. So that gives you an idea of how much range of adjustment I've got in the remote and the preload, which I like. And on the damping force, i.e. the gnarled knob at the bottom there, 0 is obviously the hardest, and you go up to 30, which is the softest. It's set as 20 as standard, so again, I've got plenty of range to play for. I'll talk about how I go along when I talk over some GoPro that I've taken to try and demonstrate some of the characteristics of the bike. The front suspension has got different valving in these gold anodized forks, which are the same dimensions, so it's the internals that are changing, and you still continue to have preload, compression and rebound adjustment. I think the adjustment, in fairness, on the standard bike is good. The valving has improved on these, and again I'll give you some feedback later. Right, the third element I talked about, aesthetics. This is obviously, it's nicknamed the yellow ball, and it's got that yellow tank with the black paint. It's got the gold wheels, it's got the anodized gold forks, and it's got various elements which have been blacked off. This here is silver on the standard bike, as indeed is the radiator side plate, and this plate here, silver. I quite like the black there. I think it ties in nicely, but aesthetics are very personal. People sometimes ask me, and indeed I see quite lively debates going on, is the bike worth the £1,350 extra? Well, all I can say is the nitrons probably cost me, that I fitted to my Jaffa, probably cost me £1,300 in the first place, and that's without upgrading the brakes. So I think the actual suspension and the braking alone would probably be £1,350. I suspect the residual value of one of these, it's not going to be £1,350 more than a standard bike is when you come to trade it in, but you might get half of it back, maybe £500-600, something like that. And then of course you get the aesthetics, and people say to me, well, I want a yellow ball, but do they do them in other colours? I'm sorry, but we might be sort of missing the point there. If you want to put some different suspension and just buy it, by all means, but I think part of the attraction, and you either like it or you don't. Some people say it's too blingy, and I get that, that's fine. I love it, but each to their own. My initial objectives when running in a bike are to loosen off the engine. I'm trying to bed in the gearbox, the clutch and the engine together. I'm scrubbing the tyres and settling in the brakes, and I'm also settling in the suspension. I find that this is best achieved by varying the load, the speed, the gears, and indeed the road that I'm on as I do so. Every engine and gearbox is different. Some need more running in than others. Indeed, as an example, my original Jaffa took significantly longer than the 1000 mile recommendation, and indeed it took about 1,700 miles before that particular bike felt loose enough and really actually wanted to go. So that's unusually long, and this SE feels much more willing almost immediately. Indeed, the restraint feels like it's me as opposed to the engine or the gearbox. I do like to run my road bikes in carefully. Kawasaki do offer guidelines, and experienced riders know, or those that have run in a few bikes, that it's a combination of the guidelines and letting the bike guide you as to what it's ready to do. The official guidelines have changed over the years. The Jaffa, which is a 2018 bike, they recommended that you do 500 miles at 4,000 revs, and that you then do for the next 500 miles up to 6,000. Nowadays they feel like they're a bit more relaxed in their proposing 250 miles at up to 4,000 and 250 to 400 miles at up to 6,000, and then 400 to 600 with bike usage described as moderate. The manual actually does state you can ride over the maximum engine revolutions briefly if necessary, and brief periods will not affect the braking results. That's my experience too, and I think that more pragmatic advice is probably more helpful than some of the more stringent formulaic approaches that some manufacturers take. Some, mostly ex or current racers, advocate short run-ins, i.e. a few heat cycles and then let it have it, as a way of making a bike perform well. Indeed, I have to admit that was my approach on my off-road race bikes many years ago. But I knew then that I would probably be rebuilding it quite quickly, so premature wear was not an issue for me. I am much more conservative to my road bikes, which I hope will last either me or the next owner considerably longer. That said, in my opinion, bikes do need to be properly revved to perform well. We're just debating when, not if. All of my bikes have experienced full acceleration when they're properly run in and the engine is properly warm. This SE feels comfortable and meshing the gears nicely. I occasionally let it have a few more revs as I accelerated up through the gears, but at no point have I given it full throttle or indeed laboured the bike. The gearbox felt smooth and precise. To change both up and down, I had no false neutrals or selections, although I do go out of my way to be precise in the early miles. For me, running the gearbox in sympathetically is a key part of the whole thing, and well worth the time spent. Some gearboxes are of course better than others, but I appear to have been lucky with both of my RS and this bike, and believe that slowing the bike through the gears in those early miles certainly helps. Tyres and brake pads need to be scrubbed in, but it doesn't take long. I actually didn't like the Dunlops fitted to my Jaffa, and felt that I'd feel the same about these, obviously fitted to the SE. The profile doesn't give as much lean angle as the Road 5s and 6s I normally fit to my bikes, and I've been taking it very easy in the salt and colder conditions. As it warms, I will soon be on the edge of these tyres, but currently, at the speed and level of commitment I'm prepared to ride at, they are okay. This might actually be because the suspension, which is definitely more controlled, balanced and compliant than my standard RS was. New suspension takes time and indeed miles to settle, and I let it do so before attempting any adjustments. The baseline settings seem good for the speeds and temperatures I was running at. Significant changes in both would normally require resetting both the compression and the rebound. This idea that you can get the suspension set up for you and that's it is sadly not actually accurate. Adjustable suspension is just that, and if you want to get the best out of it, you would be as well to Get comfortable making small adjustments as you go. I'll explain more when I do my full 1,000 mile plus review on this bike in the early summer, by which time I will have been able to form a view on how the Ohlins compared to the nitrons that I've eventually fitted to my Jaffa. They were, when I sold the bike, actually set up for more rapid progress on smoother surfaces and probably 20-degree plus temperatures. Probably too firm for February riding, and my initial perception of the SE suspension is positive. As touched on earlier, the snatchy throttles on many larger 4 cylinders is without question influenced by endeavours to reduce emissions. If in the past we could throw fuel into an engine and discard what wasn't required, nowadays more finesse is required. My Jaffa, when compared to some of the other bikes that I own, was definitely snatchy, but I could ride round it by avoiding the transition revs when the fueling is fluctuating between lean and rich, which is what causes the jerky snatch that people refer to. The SE does it as well, but it is less pronounced and quite difficult to actually demonstrate on camera. This is the closest I managed to get on my video trip. For me, this is nothing to worry about, but some are more sensitive to this than others. For those, an ECU remap is the answer, but it does invalidate your warranty, so it needs to be thought about carefully. So let's try and draw some conclusions from my experiences so far. So what are my thoughts so far? Well, I've really enjoyed the 230 miles I had on the bike. Every time I get off it, I find myself glancing back at it, which is a sure sign that you bought the right one. And it remains, as in the Z900RS, remains one of my favourite retro naked bikes. I think they're a real success. And the fact that I bought 2 of them tells you that I put my money where my mouth is. In terms of the running in, what I'm looking for, and obviously I'm looking forward to running it in more completely. I'm very pleased with how the engine and the gearbox is meshing together, but I'm looking forward to getting a bit more pace into the bike as time progresses. I'll come back to you probably after about at least 1,000 miles or so, early summer, and I'll give you some fuller feedback as to what I think once it's fully running, and give you some comparisons in terms of handling to my Jaffa, which of course had the nitrons on. One thing I haven't commented about is the brakes, giving you some detail on it, but I will just say it's certainly got a lot more feel and bite than the standard brakes. I didn't find the standard brakes an issue, in fairness. On the road I don't tend to be a late braker, but obviously when, you know, if any of you like me go on a wobble around on a track on a novice day or something, then you'll no doubt be like I am, triggering ABS every corner, but that's not how I ride on the road. I did find them better, but I don't have any problem with the standard brakes on the bike anyway. Suspension, as we've touched on, is a lot more compliant, feels really good, and certainly bodes well for the next 600 or 700 miles, which I'm looking forward to doing. I do hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, perhaps you'd be kind enough to press like or subscribe. But those of you who know me from watching the channel know that I'm not overly worried about that. What I mostly want you to do is ride safe and stay well.